Oh, great. Folks are starting to roll in. We'll just give it a few minutes here for those who've joined already. We'll just give a few moments for some more people to log in and get settled. Anisa, welcome. I'm glad you could make it in. We have a few folks logging in already to watch. I'm just giving a few moments for them to finish getting settled and logged in. We'll just give it another minute here for folks to come in. But welcome.
Thank you.
You've obviously spent a bit more time looking smart than I have tonight, Anisa.
Well, I think I'm just gonna get rolling, and as folks join in, they'll just pick up where we are. So, I mean, good afternoon for those of you who are in Canada. Maybe good evening to those of you who are logging in from Oman. Thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited. This is our first speaker series of 2021. Really happy that folks can join us, I think, from various parts of the globe today, which is really, really thrilling. For those of you who don't know me, who've logged in, my name's Marika Chandler. I'm the Ontario director here at Outward Bound Canada. And I just want to start off by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the Credit. Specifically, I'm not far from the mouth of the Humber River, which once upon a time was an important trading route prior to colonization, and also the site of the arrival of some of the first settlers in Ontario. And for those of you tuning in from Oman, acknowledging the pre-colonial Indigenous stewards of the land is one way that we can recognize and be reminded of the devastation that colonialism brought to the Indigenous people, and can be a small part of moving toward reconciliation. I'm really thrilled to be here today talking to some of our colleagues from Outward Bound Oman. Both of our guests have really fascinating stories and experience to share, and really we can focus on how Outward Bound can play a creative role in generating resilient youth. Following the conversation today, we'll have time to answer some questions from those of you who are tuning in. Please feel free to put them in the chat function, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. Just make sure that you've toggled so that all participants can see your questions. That's a really lovely, lovely feature, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those at the end as we can. Many of you know that Outward Bound Canada is a registered charity. We cultivate resilience, leadership, connections, and compassion through inspiring and challenging journeys of discovery in the natural world. So many Canadian youth are thriving in an increasingly unpredictable and changing world, don't we know it? And OB is committed to helping forge that path forward with youth. We know that we're going to be a part of building some critical skills as we start to come out of isolation and COVID-19 impacts as well. Speaking to the history of Outward Bound was actually founded in 1941 in Wales as a part of a response to World War II, and recognizing that younger sailors didn't have the same tenacity and fortitude to survive the rigors of war as some of the older sailors, and thus Outward Bound was born. And what's really wonderful is that it's since grown to 38 schools around the world in 35 different countries, 6 continents, and that's why we have the glory of being able to speak to folks from OB Oman today. So OB Oman specifically launched in May 2009 and is the first Outward Bound school in an Arabic-speaking country. So now I get to introduce these 2 lovely people who are joining us. So we have Mark Evans with us today. He's the director, the executive director, and the founding executive director of Outward Bound Oman. And we have Anisa al Raisi, who is an instructor with Outward Bound and also was the first Omani to ski to the geographic North Pole. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Wonderful. I'm going to just ask each of you questions as we go along here. And Mark, I want to start with you. So you founded Outward Bound Oman in 2009. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about the driving force behind that and some details on how far you've come in those 12 years of operating.
Yeah, so I was just you and I were talking at the start of this that I think Outward Bound Canada started in 1969, and I just wondered if I asked you the question, why was Outward Bound Canada founded? Who set it up? Because you can probably drill down to one individual who believed that this was right for Canada and for Canadian youth. So I think many Outward Bound schools around the world start with one inspirational character who's a visionary. And that person in Oman was an Englishman called Andy Wood, Dr. Andrew Wood. And Andy was the country manager of Shell, Oman. And both of his children have been through Outward Bound in the UK. And he saw the impact that it had on his own children. He saw the difference, the start and end, and he wanted to do something to really leave a legacy here in this beautiful country called Oman. And when you're country manager of Shell, you do have the capacity to make a significant difference. Your pockets are rather deeper than most. So Andy used his colleagues to really come together to set up some seed funding to establish the first Outward Bound school in the Arabic-speaking world. And the timing was absolutely right, and the place was absolutely right. Oman is the most beautiful country. It's about the size of Britain, but with only 4 million people. So if you can imagine Britain with half of the population of London, and that's it, that's Oman. So we have wilderness in abundance, and we have super talented young people like Anisa as well. And so you look at the talent here in Oman to adapt to become instructors. And Anisa is much more than an instructor now. She's business development manager here in Oman, at Outward Bound Oman. And so we started in 2009. There were four companies who came together to join hands to become our founding fathers, if you like, and we chose where we launched very carefully. We didn't want to launch in a 5-star hotel. We launched in a very humble government institution to make sure it was perfectly clear that Outward Bound Oman was an investment in grassroots society. And it started with just me. We didn't have an office. I just worked from home for about the first 4 or 5 months. I volunteered for Outward Bound in East Africa and in Scotland. And then we appointed 2 staff, and now we have, some 12 years later, 34 full-time staff. And the seed funding ran out after 5 years. The challenge was to balance the books after 5 years in a country that had no formal recognition of outdoor education, outdoor learning. So it was a real battle in the early days to convince people that letting your young people out of school with Outward Bound for 4 or 5 days was not a waste of time, but you were learning lessons that you will never learn within a classroom. So all sorts of battles in establishing Outward Bound in an environment where people just don't understand it at all. But also tremendous opportunities. We really did start Outward Bound with a blank piece of paper, which was just enabled us to be incredibly creative and innovative and design courses that really address the needs of the nation. And I'd say probably after 5 years, Prince Charles was on a visit from London to Oman. We were told by then that the Sultan of Oman, the ruler of Oman, was very, very passionate in investing in the youth and young people, would be very interested in supporting Outward Bound, but how do you bring it to his attention? Well, we identified Prince Charles as the sort of route to bring Outward Bound to the attention of the Sultan of Oman. And so the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Charles's father, the Duke of Edinburgh was the global patron of Outward Bound at the time. We managed to persuade the Duke to write a letter to His Majesty Sultan Qaboos, and Prince Charles delivered the letter. And 3 months of silence, and then a visit from the royal court, which was not tell us about Outward Bound, but it was really, how can we help? What can we do to help? Because this is exactly what Oman needs to prepare its young people for the future. And now we have 2 fantastic training centers, one in the desert, one here in Muscat, the capital city, where Anisa and I work every day. And we're halfway through the construction of a third training center at 8,000 feet altitude in the mountains, about 2 hours drive from here. So there's 12 years squeezed into 12 minutes for you.
That's great. I don't even think it was 12 minutes. So that's a wonderful synopsis, Mark. I do wonder, I mean, just thinking of that, you've spoken about the challenge of validating and really explaining to people why they should be going out for 4 or 5 days. And I'm wondering if you can share a bit more about who the youth are that are doing this in Oman. You mentioned schools, but can you tell us a little bit specifically about the youth?
Yeah, well, I mean, youth, thankfully, well, sadly for me, I am out of the band of what is considered youth, but youth in the Arab world, as Anisa will know, it's a very flexible term. So to me, it seems to stretch from 18 to 35, depending on how old or young you are. And but many of our courses are not for young people in schools, and that's one reason why we have been able to continue to run courses throughout COVID. So I've just come out of a 2.5-hour meeting now with my colleagues at the OutwardBound schools around the world, and as you can imagine, most schools are not able to do anything. OutwardBound schools are not able to run any courses, A, because of COVID, but B, because of the impact of COVID on schools, because their sole source of business is young people in schools. Well, for us, that's not our major source of business. Our major source of business is, I would say, working with the unemployed, trying to give them the tools to enable them to get the job that they want, to get their first job, get onto that first step of the ladder. I mean, I think every year, Anisa will probably know better than I do, I think it's about 50 or 60,000 young people a year enter the job market here in Oman. If you look at the demographics of Canada, it's probably the same as UK. Very, very small young population, but an aging population that's getting bigger and bigger. Mm-hmm. So the challenges that face Canada are the complete inverse of the challenges that face most Gulf Arab states. I think 60% of our population are under 30 years old. Mm-hmm. So the pressures on the government here are such that employment of those young people is a national priority, but alongside that comes the issue of employability. And that's where OutwardBound comes in, really, is we see ourselves as a bridge that connects the world of education to the world of employment. Because, when you were founded in 1969, I think there were 6 schools in Oman. That was it. Right.
Yeah.
6 schools. And when His Majesty came to the throne, he came out with this very profound statement that education is the future of Oman, and it has to start today, even if it's under the shade of a tree. Mm-hmm. And so many of the early schools in Oman, within living memory of many people, many Omanis started their education in the shade of a tree. So that's how far education has evolved. It evolved in Oman in a very short space of time.
Well, and it's really interesting. I mean, you're touching on a point that we also talk quite a bit about. And in fact, we did a social return on investment study. And a big piece of that is looking at the link between what you're learning on expedition and how that then relates to employability skills and success farther beyond. And I think Anisa's, going to speak to that too from a personal standpoint. But I think, it's really interesting with OutwardBound being all around the world. These are the common threads that really bind us together. So it's really great to hear you say that, Mark. Anisa, I'm curious to hear from you. I mean, you have a very unique path and a really fascinating story. I'm really keen to hear a little bit about your own exploration as well. I mean, you are the first Omani to go to the geographic North Pole. You traveled 1,200 kilometers in 50 days from north to south along the spine of Oman as well in a separate expedition. I'm wondering if you can share some highlights from these expeditions and some things that you've learned from that experience.
Wow.
It's a big
How
question.
long do we have?
Yeah.
No, honestly, a lot of learnings from each of the expeditions. So I was lucky enough to join the North Pole expedition about 2 years ago, where it was my first real expedition. And so but we weren't, it wasn't a guided expedition. So it was unguided, and we had to, as a team, we're 11 women, a Euro-Arabian team. So getting the two cultures together, that was the main objective. And working together, a lot of us were first timers. Some of them had never even camped outdoors. So it was quite an experience going through that training together, you know, over 2 years, coming together as a team. The importance of teamwork, that is one massive learning, a very obvious one, I think, from working in the outdoors. It just goes to show that you can't rely on yourself. In this community, I think also, especially in the modern world now, we feel like, okay, we can be independent, but what is independence? You still need the community and the support system around you. And that's very important, which was key actually for this latest expedition that I just came back from. I mean, a 50-day expedition, planned to be 50 days. We actually did it in 47. And we thought it was 1,200 kilometers, but it turned out to be 1,500 closer to. So yeah. But it would not have been possible without the teamwork, not only of the direct teams, so myself and Major Natalie, she was my team member, the two of us walked together, and as well as the support team that was with us. But more importantly, I think the community that came together, the sponsors, it was very last minute with the planning. It took 2 years of preparing. So this is another lesson, the planning and preparation, that's massive for something as big as this. And it took 2 years getting the sponsors together, understanding the route, getting the marketing, the branding. You know, we're very lucky to have partnered with MNC Saatchi, London-based marketing company, and they helped us get the name across. You know, Outward Bound was massive support, me having worked there, but also just Mark's experience in the outdoors. He's, you know, had quite a few adventures, including kayaking all along the coastline of Oman. Part of our expedition was the first 100 kilometers was kayaking as well. So the objective of this was really to go in a straight line. And as you both were discussing just now, we've come a long way in these last 50 years. So it was on the occasion that for the 50th National Day that I wanted to show the youth of Oman. This was really to inspire the youth to get outdoors, but also to show them how far we have come and what we should be proud of as Omanis. You know, 50 years ago, it would have been impossible that I would be walking Oman, let alone even speaking to you in English, you know, on this computer here, or have been educated. So we've come a long way as a nation, and that needs to be celebrated. So these were the key messages that we had for Yelago, and massive learnings. So resilience, that was, I think, the key. So it was 50 days, and it's about, you know, 30, 35 kilometers a day that we had to go in a straight line. So it was about not finding shortcuts, but having to, resilience is about being able to face the obstacle ahead of you and overcome that, find a solution with your team, plan for it before you get there. And should something unexpected happen, try and find a way around it. So that was a massive story throughout the expedition. I mean, halfway through, my teammate Natalie got an injury. And she unfortunately had to leave, which meant that I had almost another, it was just over halfway through, so about 20 something more days to go through. And at that half point, like Mark was saying after I got back, you know, halfway through an expedition is probably the hardest point. You're physically tired and drained. You're halfway there, but you think, okay, I've got double that distance to go now. So yeah, resilience was a massive one. Yeah.
I mean,
I could go on forever. So
well, and me too. I feel like you've said so much in there that I want to learn a little bit more about. I mean, first of all, you just very easily said, well, it was supposed to be a 50-day expedition of 1,200 kilometers, but we actually did 1,500 kilometers in 47 days. So you went farther in a shorter amount of time, and you seemingly said that like it was no big deal, despite having to overcome the challenge of also losing a teammate along the way. I mean, that's amazing.
You know, some days, and we had to be agile as well along the way. So some days, for example, I had my blisters were so bad that I just couldn't move. Kayaking, some days on kayaking, it was my first time kayaking, so I didn't even know about gloves. Mark, you forgot that little tip there. And so I got blisters all over. There were days where we had to take breaks, but then there are other days where we had to make up for that lost time, basically. So it's all about being agile and changing plan as you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so incredible. And I got to watch a video of you speaking about your North Pole trip as well. And I know there was a lot of silence and, you know, not being able to speak to those around you because of the weather conditions around you as well, and just all the equipment you have to wear. But I've heard you say, I've never kayaked before. You know, I can't imagine you'd never been to the North Pole before. I don't know if you'd ever been in, you know, that level of cold or snow. It sounds to me like...
No, I studied on Austria, but that's not comparable.
I mean, good for you. That's great. But I mean, you are personally taking on all of these challenges that are firsts for you, and maybe even sometimes things you don't entirely know what you're getting into. So I wonder, that takes a lot of bravery. And you're saying you want to be an inspiration. Oman's come very far. I mean, you're an inspiration to me, and I'm sitting in Canada. But I'm wondering what motivates you to take these things on.
You know, true story is, it's not because we're in a call with Outward Bound, but that was a turning point in my life, honestly. So 6 years ago, I came from a corporate background, a very different background. And 6 years ago, I applied to Outward Bound. Mark initially rejected me, actually, saying that, no, you're not going to stick for this job too long because you came from a completely different background. I told him, I'll remind you 6 years later.
There you are.
Here we are, Mark. And so, no, it was a turning point for me because it was just before. The reason I chose to join Outward Bound is because when I left my corporate job, I sort of went on one of those trips where you're, you know, traveling and just self-discovery. And I realized a lot of the things I was doing and I enjoyed the most, that was the most memorable, was things that was outside my comfort zone. I'm scared of heights. And I went on a high rope course over there and eventually started climbing since then, you know, and I love climbing now. Still scared of heights, but I don't think you overcome your fears. You just learn to control them. Yeah. And so, from that point on, then I decided to join Outward Bound and wanted to do this for a living and show people that, you know, through this comes a sense of freedom, through overcoming what you think are your boundaries or your limitations or your fears. Comes a sense of freedom, and I wanted others to experience it, and I thought Outward Bound would be the perfect place for me, and that's how it started.
Gosh, I love that connection to freedom. What a wonderful, that's just such a wonderful way of framing it. I wonder, I mean, how have those personal experiences fed your work with youth?
Well,
has there been any impact there?
I hope so. I hope so. I enjoy talking to the youth a lot. So in an Outward Bound experience, you know, you've got the reflection time, you've got, even after the activities or discussions, you've got time to give them real life examples. So before I would have just given real life examples of stories I've heard and so on of other people, but now I'm able to give a real life example from my own experience. I think that's a lot more impactful. Just this week, I haven't been out on courses for a while, being very busy with business development at the moment. Just last week, I finally got to meet some of the students again. So I was driving them. We're now with, you know, COVID, trying to keep it minimal contact. And so instead of using a bus, we're driving the students to the destinations, to wherever we start the course. And so I was driving them that day, and I started talking to them about Yelago and the experience and all. And they came back with, the instructors today came back saying that one of their most memorable parts of the entire experience was that conversation. So I am humbled, but I think I could have an impact over here, you know? So yeah, it's great.
Well, that's really amazing. Thank you so much, Anisa, for sharing. And you referenced, I mean, Mark's also had a fair share of adventures. So, you know, just kind of making that link, Mark, in 2016, you and a team of Omanis became the first people in 85 years to retrace the first crossing of the largest sand desert on Earth, 49 days on foot and by camel. You've also been on 3 expeditions, I understand, through the Northwest Territories, the Northwest Passage, Nunavut. I'd just love to hear your perspective on those experiences in those different places as well, and what learnings you've taken from that and brought to OB Oman.
Well, I mean, both environments are deserts. and there's huge similarities. I get such a great feeling of contentment when I'm in the middle of nowhere, and you know, and I get that same feeling of purity and contentment when I'm skiing in virgin snow with all those little crystals, those diamonds shining in the sunlight, when there's not a sight of a human being in any direction. And I get the same feeling when I'm walking in the desert here in the virgin sand. And you know, they're both wind-blown environments and wind-carved environments, sand and snow. So they're very, very similar. What I put in the back of my sled to ski across the Greenland ice cap is not too different to what I throw into the back of my Land Rover to go on an expedition to the desert for the weekend. It's just slightly less feathers in your sleeping bag. But our trips to Northwest Passage were just fantastic. I mean, it's just such an extraordinary country that you live in. We would fly to Calgary. I think we were doing it in the 90s. Fly to Calgary, flight onto Yellowknife. We bought a couple of Canadian canoes in Yellowknife, put them on the plane to Resolute Bay. We got to Resolute Bay. We chartered a twin otter and discovered that it was a bit of a squeeze getting 2 Canadian canoes in a twin otter, plus a couple of huskies, plus all of our food for a month. And the twin otter flew west to a totally uninhabited island called Melville Island. And Melville Island is just an open air museum for polar exploration. And so Franklin, the search for Franklin passed through there, but we were retracing an expedition that took place in the 1820s by an Englishman called Parry, William Edward Parry. And the learnings I take from that, so an incredible island, totally uninhabited. We were there for a month on our own, just 4 of us, surrounded by beautiful white Arctic wolves. Almost every day I would have a wolf sniffing the end of my gloves sometimes, and they knew no fear. They never saw any human beings at all. And we'd be discovering things that were 170 years old, just lying there and on the snow and the ice, old wooden barrels and metal canisters with messages left inside, which was the way the British Navy communicated their position in the 1820s, 1830s. So Melville was an extraordinary place. But when you read this guy's book, I've got it on the bookshelf here, actually. It's a really thick diary of the journal of his expedition there in the 1820s. So if you can put yourself in his position, age 29, in charge of the lives of 90 people. And when you sailed from London in 2 boats, you sailed with 3 years worth of food, because you never knew how long it was going to take you. You know, Anisa says 1,200 became 1,500. But for these guys, they could have they nearly got through the Northwest Passage in the first attempt, but they just got frozen in. Named this uninhabited island after the Lord of the Admiralty, Viscount Melville. And what kept all of his men apart from one alive. So they were frozen into the sea ice for a year, 4 months of total darkness, -30, -40 degrees. And people laughed at Parry because when he set sail from London, one of the last 2 things that were loaded onto the boat, one was a barrel organ and one was a printing press. And people thought, what the heck do you need those for on the journey through the Northwest Passage? But he was such a great leader, and he was always he understood that if things didn't work out well, the challenge would not be the cold, it would be the impact of the cold and the isolation on the mental well-being of his men. And so he knew that the only way to keep them alive through those 4 months of total darkness was routine and creativity. And so every morning you'd get up 6 o'clock, shake the ice off your hammock over the side of the boat onto the sea ice, do your physical exercise. You'd all line up on the deck. The ship's surgeon would inspect your gums for scurvy. And then the barrel organ came into being because every month they had a theatrical production on board the boat, and everybody had a part. So every day there were rehearsals. You had to learn your lines, and then every month you'd have a theatrical production, and then it would roll and roll. They had a printing press, so they produced the most northerly newspaper in the world called the North Georgia Gazette. 2 sheets of paper. They sell for about £10,000 a copy in London today in antique bookshops. And And so I took great inspiration from Parry, and I used his philosophy. I led my own expedition to Svalbard for 36 young people in 2001. So we overwintered at 80 degrees north, and we equally had 4 months of total darkness. And so that same philosophy, that same strategy of leadership, I think has shaped a lot of what I've done in terms of my own expeditions, but also in terms of Outward Bound. But I think there's other lessons for us to learn from these old explorers, because we get wrapped up at Outward Bound Oman, as Anisa will well know. We follow the World Economic Forum. We're always looking at future skills. Is what we're delivering at Outward Bound giving young people the tools for the future? So we tend to be very forward-looking, but actually you can learn so much by looking back and learning from the people who've gone before. And one of my favorite authors is a guy called Joe Owen. And Joe's written a book called Tribal Leadership School. And Joe traveled around the world living with indigenous communities. And he asked the question, so all of these people live on the edge of human existence, the Inuit, the Bedouin, the Maasai in East Africa, the reindeer herders in northern Scandinavia. And he asked himself the question, how can these people survive some of the most challenging environments on Earth, but not just survive, they thrive. And yet, when you look at the FTSE 100 index set up in the 1980s in London, 100 companies that were so huge we could never imagine a world without them. And yet, less than 10 of them survive today. So Joe asks the question, what lessons can the corporate world today learn from traditional society? How can they survive and thrive in really challenging environments when the corporate giants tend to really struggle to survive beyond a couple of decades? So the learning that I take from my time in northern Canada and Greenland and following Nansen and Parry is that there's as much value looking back when it comes to shaping your thinking as there is looking forward sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on another point there too, which I think is really key, and that's the isolation factor, which, Anisa referenced as well, and just where you go in that. And I think what you've spoken about, there's a number of things in there that I'd love to talk more about, but one of them is that isolation factor. I mean, this pandemic alone is putting us in some similar scenarios to wilderness expeditions and those remote spaces. I mean, so to share from Canada, it's been identified through the participation report card that 62% of kids and teens are being less physically active outdoors during the pandemic, and 79% are spending more leisure time on their screens. So, we think about that isolation factor. We're seeing that demonstrated through these statistics. Also, the Mental Health Commission, did a study saying 48% of youth feel isolated and lonely. Here, at Outward Bound Canada, we're doing everything we can to encourage as many youth to get out in nature, recognizing we still have limitations organizationally because of the pandemic. But I'm wondering, if both of you could share a little bit about, you've referenced this a little in the beginning, and maybe we can start with Anisa, but just how is OB Oman working to help alleviate those things? I'm presuming the situation is similar in Oman in that the isolation factor is on the higher level than it would be in normal times. So I'm wondering, maybe Anisa, if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yes, you're very right. It certainly is. And we've noticed that a few months ago, actually. When was it? Just, I think, mid last year, where we started preparing for, assuming that in the next few months, or we don't know how long this pandemic will last, eventually, anxiety, stress, and through isolation will be a problem. We started to have these discussions within Outward Bound, and then eventually reports started to come out on this internationally. And then we started working very closely with the Ministry of Health over here, trying to get the statistics in through them. Is that the case in Oman as well? Having that confirmed, eventually, we designed a course called Build Your Resilience, targeting mainly this group, as you say, giving them the tools and the right processes, how to overcome anxiety, isolation, thinking more about the future and actually planning ahead, but being agile in the process. Knowing that this pandemic is here, we don't know how long it's going to last. What are the ways that we could overcome this? But first, working with your cognitive behavioral cycle, all starting with that and so on. So bringing some models in for them as well, having these indoor courses. So that really helped. And eventually we started then working outdoors and, like you say, encouraging them. So that was the first step in trying to encourage everybody to get back outdoors as well. So over here as well, I would say locally, it was in the very beginning of the pandemic, a little bit more restrictive on going outdoors, rather stay indoors. But now the government is even encouraging go out into the wild, as in, don't gather, but you're okay to go out into the wild. It's safer there rather.
Great.
So
yeah, well, that's really interesting to hear. Thank you. I mean, maybe offline, I'd love to talk more about that program, but it sounds wonderful. I mean, we were able to run some expeditions in 2020, and the impact that had on the youth was just, I mean, it's always palpable, but it was just the next level. Yeah, absolutely. Mark, is there anything you want to add to that, just as far as how OB Oman is responding to these challenging times?
No, I think Anisa summarized it very well. I mean, the only thing I would say is that we didn't think it would be any different, but really the length of the waiting list for young people to come on these courses was just a real indicator. And when we started talking to counsellors at some of the universities, the magnitude of issues that they were having to deal with of this nature is greater than it's ever been. So whether you're in Canada or Oman, the issue is pretty much the same. And Outward Bound is playing a vital role in depressurizing that situation. And as Anisa says, just giving people a bit of slightly lifting their horizons a little bit, and not looking at today, but looking a little bit further ahead, and just learning that you're not on your own. When you're sharing that experience of a course with Outward Bound with several other people, then there's all sorts of support that comes from that.
Mm-hmm. Actually, that's a really key statement, I think, and it ties into something Anisa said earlier about those large expeditions you did and how you really learned to rely on the team in a challenging time. Everybody from your marketing team to that partner who's with you on the ground going through it. And that's one of the things I talk with schools about here and different groups and individuals is, our group sizes really mean that you have to rely on each other. There is going to be a point where you are entirely 100% needed as a member of that team. And I think in this environment, it's the same. And when I read those stats about how mental health challenges are on the rise, like it's that teamwork that we see in the field brought into a new spectrum. Who are those supports that are around you right now? Which is, I think, Mark, what you're pointing to. Like, what is that team that's in your home isolated environment, or that you're connected to in that physically distant way? So yeah, I think that's a really great point, and kind of centers around what we build on an expedition as well.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has been just fantastic. I think I could talk to you both all day. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, which I think is okay. I think I can imagine our viewers have taken a lot from this, but I'm just really thankful for the two of you joining us and sharing your stories. And I'm thankful to everybody who's tuned in and those who may watch later on YouTube. I mean, it's just been a really lovely conversation to hear about another Outward Bound school, around the globe. And it's interesting that I can see them both behind Mark on the world map there. But I'm just super thankful and have a lot of gratitude for this conversation. As a bit of a plug, we do have another speaker series coming up in June. So we're excited to host that one, and there'll be information forthcoming about who's going to be on that one. But again, just thanks, Mark and Anisa. This has been really fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.